When I first started paying attention to international hiring, I assumed the hardest part would be finding the right people. That seemed logical. If you're hiring across different countries, time zones, and talent markets, recruiting should be the biggest challenge. At least that's what I thought. But the more I looked into how companies actually build international teams, the more I realized that hiring isn't usually where the complexity begins. In many cases, it's where the complexity starts. Finding a great candidate is often the easy part. What comes after is where things get interesting. You need contracts, you need payroll, you need compliance processes, you need onboarding workflows that work across different countries and legal frameworks. And perhaps most importantly, you need systems that continue working as your team grows. That's something I think many companies underestimate at first. When you hire your first international contractor or employee, almost any process feels manageable. A spreadsheet works, a few manual reminders work, a handful of recurring tasks don't seem like a big deal, but growth changes the equation. One contractor becomes 5, 5 becomes 20, one country becomes several. And suddenly you're spending more time maintaining workflows than improving them. That's why I think many conversations about international hiring platforms miss the point. Most reviews focus on feature lists. They compare pricing pages. They compare country coverage. They compare product screenshots. Those things matter. But after spending more time researching platforms like Deel and Remote, I started thinking about a different question. Not which platform had the most features, but which platform removed the most operational friction, because once international hiring becomes part of your normal business operations, that's what starts mattering. And that's the perspective I want to use for this comparison. Not which platform is better in theory, but how each platform feels once global hiring becomes part of your day-to-day reality. I think another reason these conversations have become more relevant is that the way companies hire has changed dramatically over the last few years. Not long ago, international hiring was something most organizations considered only after reaching a certain size. You opened an office, established a local presence, built infrastructure, and then hired employees. Today, the sequence often looks completely different. Companies hire internationally first and figure out expansion later. A startup in one country may hire a developer in another. A software company may build a support team across multiple regions. A growing business may recruit specialized talent wherever it happens to exist. Geography has become far less important than it used to be. But while access to talent has become easier, managing that talent has not necessarily become simpler. In many ways, it has introduced an entirely new layer of operational complexity. You're no longer managing one employment framework, you're managing several. You're no longer thinking about one payroll process, you're thinking about multiple countries, different regulations, and different administrative requirements. That's one reason platforms like Deel and Remote have become such an important part of the conversation. They're not simply helping companies hire internationally. They're helping companies operate internationally. And I think that's an important distinction, because once hiring expands beyond a single country, the challenge isn't finding talent anymore. The challenge is building systems that can support talent wherever that talent happens to be. One thing I noticed while researching this comparison is that most platform reviews tend to follow the same formula. They compare pricing, they compare features, they compare country coverage, and sometimes they compare user interfaces. There's nothing wrong with that. Those factors absolutely matter when you're evaluating software, but I don't think they're the full story, because software rarely creates value simply because a feature exists. The real question is whether that feature makes day-to-day operations easier. That's a very different way of looking at a platform, and I think it's especially important when we're talking about international hiring. The reason is simple. Most companies don't struggle because they lack tools. They struggle because they have too many moving parts. A contract needs to be updated. A payment needs to be processed. A new contractor needs to be onboarded. A compliance question appears unexpectedly. None of those things feels particularly difficult on its own. The challenge comes from repetition. The same processes happen again and again, across different countries, across different team members, across different hiring situations, and over time, small inefficiencies start accumulating. That's why I think operational experience matters more than many comparison articles suggest. A platform can look impressive on a pricing page, can have dozens of features, but if your team still spends significant time coordinating routine workflows, the experience may not feel as efficient as expected. That perspective changed how I looked at Deel and Remote. Instead of asking which platform offers more functionality, I started paying attention to something else: how much operational attention each platform requires from the people using it. Because in growing organizations, attention is often the most limited resource, and the platforms that reduce operational friction tend to create value in ways that aren't always obvious at first glance. When I started looking more closely at Deel, the first thing that stood out wasn't a specific feature. It was the overall feeling of how the platform approaches international operations. And I realized that may sound vague at first, but after comparing enough software products, I've noticed that the experience of using a platform often matters more than the feature list itself, because eventually teams stop evaluating tools based on what they can do. They start evaluating them based on how much work they remove. That's where Deel felt interesting to me. The platform generally feels designed around reducing operational friction, particularly in areas like contractor management, onboarding workflows, and recurring administrative processes. Those may not be the most exciting parts of international hiring, but they're often the parts that consume the most attention over time. One thing I kept coming back to was workflow speed, not speed in the sense of clicking buttons faster, but speed in the sense of moving from one stage of a process to the next without creating unnecessary coordination work. In growing organizations, that's a meaningful difference because operational bottlenecks rarely appear all at once. They appear gradually. A contractor agreement needs updating. A payment cycle repeats. A new hire joins from another country. A team member needs access to documentation. Each task feels small, but together they create a significant amount of operational overhead. What I found interesting about Deel is that many of those recurring processes feel connected. The platform seems designed around the assumption that international hiring isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing operational system. And that distinction matters because the needs of a company hiring one international contractor are very different from the needs of a company managing dozens of people across multiple countries. Another thing I noticed is that Deel tends to feel flexible. Different organizations operate differently. Some teams move quickly, some have formal approval structures, some hire contractors heavily, others focus on full-time employees. The platform generally feels adaptable to different operating styles rather than forcing every company into the same workflow. Now, that doesn't automatically make Deel the right choice for everyone, but it does explain why many fast-growing remote teams seem drawn to it, not necessarily because of a single feature, but because the overall experience feels optimized for organizations that expect international hiring to become a recurring part of their operations. And as I continued comparing Deel with Remote, that idea kept resurfacing. The real difference wasn't what the platforms could do, it was how they approached the day-to-day realities of managing global teams. Now, if this comparison ended with Deel, it wouldn't be much of a comparison, because the reason platforms like Remote continue to grow is that they're solving many of the same problems. And in some situations, They may even feel like a better fit. One thing I noticed while looking at remote is that the platform often feels more structured. That's probably the first word that comes to mind, structured. The workflows generally feel designed around consistency and standardization. For some organizations, that's exactly what they're looking for. Not every company wants maximum flexibility. Some teams prefer clearly defined processes, formal approval structures, and a more guided operational experience. Remote often feels aligned with that mindset. And to be clear, that's not a criticism. In fact, there are situations where additional structure can be beneficial, especially for organizations building compliance-heavy processes or managing larger operational frameworks. Another thing I noticed is that remote often presents itself through the lens of employment infrastructure. The platform gives the impression that compliance, employment management, and global workforce administration are central priorities. That emphasis may create additional confidence for companies that place a high value on process consistency. At the same time, I occasionally felt that the experience was slightly more formal than what some fast-moving teams may prefer. Again, that's not necessarily a weakness. It depends entirely on how an organization operates. A company with highly structured internal processes may see that as a strength. A startup moving quickly across multiple markets may evaluate the experience differently. And I think that's where many comparisons become overly simplistic. People often look for a winner, but software decisions rarely work that way. The better question is, which platform aligns more closely with the way your team actually works? If your organization values consistency, formal processes, and a structured operational environment, remote may feel very comfortable. If your team prioritizes adaptability, speed, and reducing operational coordination wherever possible, you may gravitate toward a different experience. And honestly, that's why I think Deel and Remote continue to coexist successfully. They're solving many of the same challenges. They're simply approaching those challenges from slightly different operational philosophies. The more time I spent comparing them, the less I saw a battle between competitors. And the more I saw two different interpretations of how international hiring should work. While comparing these platforms, I kept thinking about a scenario that probably sounds familiar to many growing companies. Imagine you're running a business with a small remote team. At first, everything feels manageable. You hire a contractor in one country. A few months later, you bring on someone else in another region, then another. And before long, your team is spread across multiple countries. What's interesting is that the challenge usually doesn't arrive all at once. There's rarely a moment where someone says, "We have a global hiring problem." Instead, small operational tasks start appearing more frequently. Someone needs a contract update, a payment question comes up, a new hire needs onboarding documents, an employment requirement needs clarification. Individually, these tasks don't seem particularly significant, but collectively they begin competing for attention. And that's often the moment when teams start looking at platforms differently. They're no longer asking whether a platform can support international hiring. They already know it can. They're asking whether it can reduce the amount of coordination required to keep everything running smoothly. I think that's why so many software evaluations eventually become workflow evaluations. The discussion shifts away from features and toward operational experience. Because when teams are growing, efficiency isn't usually about doing more work. It's about needing less manual effort to achieve the same outcome. And that's the lens I found most useful when looking at both Deel and Remote. Not what they promise on a landing page, but what they help teams avoid dealing with repeatedly as operations become more complex. The more time I spent thinking about this comparison, the more I realized that the biggest differences between Deel and Remote don't usually appear at the beginning. They appear later, and that's important. Because almost every system feels effective at small scale. When you have one international contractor, most workflows feel manageable. When you have 2 or 3 employees in different countries, manual coordination still seems reasonable. At that stage, the differences between platforms can feel relatively small, but growth changes the picture. As teams expand, the number of recurring processes grows quietly in the background. Contracts need attention, payments repeat, new hires need onboarding, documentation needs updating, compliance questions appear unexpectedly. None of those tasks is particularly difficult on its own. The challenge comes from accumulation. That's something I think many organizations underestimate. Operational friction rarely arrives all at once. It builds gradually. And because it builds gradually, it's easy to overlook until it starts consuming a meaningful amount of time. I remember speaking with founders who described international hiring as manageable right up until the point where it suddenly wasn't. Nothing dramatic happened. There wasn't a single breaking point. There were simply more people, more countries, and more recurring processes competing for attention. That's why I believe operational attention is one of the most underrated concepts in software evaluation. Most companies compare features, some compare pricing, a few compare integrations, but very few ask how much attention a platform requires after implementation. And in growing organizations, attention is often the most valuable resource available. The teams that scale effectively are usually not the teams working the hardest. They're the teams spending their energy on the right problems. That's where I noticed a meaningful difference in how Deel and Remote felt. Deel often gave me the impression that it was designed to reduce operational coordination as hiring activity expanded. Remote, on the other hand, often felt designed around consistency and structured workforce management. Neither approach is inherently right or wrong. Both solve legitimate business problems, but they optimize for slightly different priorities. And I think that's the key insight from this comparison. The decision isn't simply about payroll. It isn't simply about compliance. It's about the operational experience your team wants to create as international hiring becomes a larger part of the business, because eventually the platform itself becomes less important than the habits and workflows it creates around your team. And that's usually where the long-term value is found. One thing I found interesting throughout this comparison is how my own evaluation criteria started changing. At the beginning, I was looking at the same things most people look at: features, country coverage, payroll capabilities, compliance support. And those things are still important, but the longer I spent thinking about international hiring, the more I found myself asking a different question. Not which platform could do more, but which platform required less attention from the team using it. That may sound like a small distinction, but I don't think it is, because most growing companies aren't limited by software anymore. They're limited by focus. Every hour spent managing repetitive administrative work is an hour not spent on customers, hiring, product development, or growth. And that's why I think operational attention is such an underrated concept. The best systems aren't necessarily the ones with the most features. They're often the ones that quietly remove work from people's calendars, the ones that reduce follow-ups, the ones that eliminate unnecessary coordination, the ones that allow teams to focus on decisions instead of administration. As I looked at both Deel and Remote, that became the lens I kept returning to. Not which platform looked better on paper, but which platform seemed more likely to reduce operational effort as hiring expanded across multiple countries. And honestly, I think that's the question more organizations should ask when evaluating any software that becomes part of their everyday operations, because features are easy to compare. The cost of attention is much harder to see, but over time it's often the thing that matters most. After spending more time comparing Deel and Remote, I don't think the most useful conclusion is to declare a winner, at least not in the traditional sense, because throughout this comparison I kept coming back to the same realization. Both platforms solve real problems. Both help companies hire internationally. Both reduce the complexity that comes with managing global teams. The difference is how they approach that challenge. Remote often feels more structured, more process-oriented, more focused on consistency across workforce operations. For certain organizations, that may be exactly what they're looking for, especially if internal processes are already highly structured and standardized. Deel, on the other hand, consistently felt more operationally flexible. The platforms seem designed around helping teams move quickly while reducing the amount of manual coordination required behind the scenes. And personally, that's where I found the most value, not because flexibility is always better, but because growing teams often need systems that can adapt as hiring requirements evolve. If there's one lesson I took away from this comparison, it's that international hiring becomes less about software features over time and more about operational attention. The real question isn't whether a platform can handle payroll or compliance. Most leading platforms can. The question is how much attention your team needs to spend managing those processes once they become part of everyday operations. And that's usually where the long-term differences start to appear. If you're currently evaluating Deel and Remote, I'd encourage you to look beyond feature lists and pricing tables. Think about the way your team works. Think about the workflows you repeat every month. Think about the operational experience you want to create as your company grows, because that's often where the right decision becomes much clearer. And if you'd like a deeper breakdown of this comparison, including some of the points I couldn't fully cover in this episode, I've included additional resources in the description below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.